some years ago, a big topic for me because there had been in the German climate move, not just climate, but adherent topics. There were a lot of very emotionally heavy things happening at the same time, very bad experiences, a lot of state repression, state violence, and suddenly people burning out all over and not knowing how to cope with this. And I think people have been learning from this a lot by pain, but when I talk to people who have been active in this phase and like who have worked through this, and there's so much effort put into giving or just joining now this tools, and like also this just this thought of you're not helping anyone if you're hurting yourself.
Burnout mitigation is so important in terms of like how we structure things foundationally, but also, I mean, like for instance, I've definitely had a lot of experiences where people are like, they're so fed up, and it's like crashing out. And any time that I've disengaged from working with a movement or an organization, it was because of a trauma offloading that I felt was neurophysically destabilizing for me. And when I attempted to invite us to do a reconciliation process, that was not an offering that was taken. So I'm like, I totally understand people having trauma moment, and we trauma offload, we make mistakes, we're quite human. And I know reconciliation processes are very difficult for people, but this is something that's important for me because I have a sense of personal dignity, which I am responsible for making sure is intact in the systems that I'm in.
That's another thing. There are a lot of people, because of the lack of system processes and a lot of liminality, that burn out on the space. And I'm always joking, like, I'm not going to stock my whole capacity for patience and engagement in a system that's still very much in flux. You know what I mean? I'm going to step in when I can and then step out and provide boundaries when my capacity for contribution in that particular system has been met. And as a result, I can sustain engagement in the system rather than burning out emotionally on my perceptions of where the system should be right now, especially if you look at the history. I'm like, oh, this is actually repeated quite a bit. So the idea that in my iteration or in the next 3 or 4 iterations it's somehow going to be resolved is unrealistic. It's got a bit of a longer process now that it's kind of set in a system that's somewhat chaotic, and I think it's a great learning opportunity. I hate to say this, on a universal cosmic level. I'm like, we really want to be these liminal beings. But the second that we're in a liminal space where we don't have these logistical realities solid in our hands, it's a bit of a struggle, and it's not that we don't deserve it, it's that we have to look at like deconstructing the binary in general anyway, and what an invitation to do that within our own selves and within our systems when you're greeted with it.
When you have people who are very much showing the disturbance, like a sentence that has came to me a lot during the last weeks was that very often it's the person that is showing the dirt on the ground that is hurt, and not the person that is making the dirt or like creating the dirt. And how maybe we can rethink the sentence about how maybe it's not about hurting the person that's creating the dirt, like it's not about the hurt, but that it's about first maybe cleaning up the dirt or like taking care of how the dirt is formed, and having emotional processes being so much more important than a lot of people hold them to be. And how I'm reading the autobiography of Emma Goldman right now, like 19th, early 20th century anarchist. And what is occurring to me so often is that a lot of the problems they have then, like more than 100 years ago, is people emotionally not being able to handle political communities, and how often it feels like some structural things have changed, but like the way that people act in communities where people have understood a lot of how capitalism works, how systems of violence or oppression work, how few things in how the people act have actually changed, and how a lot of it is about emotional handling occurrences, either as a person or as a group. And for me, work with groups in transformative justice during the year, and seeing how difficult it is in every single process of hurt happening to not let your emotions go and fire against a perpetrator or a presumed perpetrator, and like assigning the binary of violator and violated, and like recreating the system of how hard forgiveness actually is, and how important it is to see the structures behind violence while not recreating violence ourselves if we don't need it to have in a single situation to be able to stand.
My goodness. Yeah, I mean, I often when I'm doing like a mediation-based process, for instance, like a dissolution of an organization or a community, I often say, okay, we're going to do this 2-point process. We're going to have an emotional processing, and then we're going to have a logistical meeting. So many logistical processes can get nowhere because they're so clogged with all the emotional processes. And oftentimes this happens by just doing a separate counseling session with the individuals. Because I think also we have this struggle around validation, for instance. I think it's so human to want to have our concerns, our experiences validated. And oftentimes we're seeking that in people who don't necessarily recognize it. And it's definitely not the source of which we're going to get that validation. But then being able to have a source for it, to have that kind of reality check and feel listened to, and to be able to walk through our process and the emotional pain that's part of it, so necessary for then the logistical steps to continue to move forward. And oftentimes they're like overlaid, and I'm like, this is so inefficient. And then, like you said, oftentimes the emotional process is completely ignored. And it's just like, that's literally impossible. You're not making it anywhere because all of those things are going to act their way out in different things. It actually reminded me, I'm doing an alchemy of apology workshop on the 1st, somewhat informed by Eve Ensler, and to walk through some process of reconciliation, because it's another one of those things I noticed. I mean, one of the phrases I often say is like, the last year of graduate school is all about reverse engineering common sense, because it's just not common anymore. And it's another thing I noticed is that people do not know. They really actually struggle with apologizing. And it's not even, it's just a pattern. You know, that's their pattern of engagement, is that they don't admit fault for whatever reason, and that people really do want to be honored in that way. And actually, Eve Ensler, who is a survivor of childhood sexual trauma, created this framework so that those who had been abused could draft things from the perspective of their abusers, since abusers rarely were the ones to provide these apologies. So then how do you, and I've had problematic relationships that were completely transformed for me because I'm in the loop, as we can be, of like, why aren't they getting this? And then I actually write this meaningful apology that, like, in the nature of it, all that comes out about all the struggle that they're going through and all the difficulty it is to step into that place where they honor themselves enough to even honor me. And it's been so healing for me in relationships where I'm like, they're just not at the level to be able to provide this for me. But I know them so well that I know that this apology is somewhere written in their heart. You know what I mean? And I needed the words because, again, as humans, we need validation, especially if we deal with narcissists or gaslighters and things like that. That's so intergenerational. This is how they know to communicate and love. And yet it's so harmful, you know, to the human consciousness to be exposed to this. But these are humans, and they deserve the same level of unconditional positive regard about the core of their being as anyone else. So being able to do this drafted work to receive from them something that they don't even have the capacity to give, but probably would if they could, I think is really, really healing to the human spirit.
In regards to healing interpersonal or like just emotional stress in a lot of contexts, for me also in group processes, getting together in big groups and getting a lot of emotion in that there's in this certain situation. There's so many different spirits floating around with so many different experiences and so much tiny conflicts happening at the same time. What is really interesting to me is something that some friends of mine do now. It's a play experience. They over the course of the year, they have several spaces which are like decorated in an alien kind of way. It's called Fantasonia. It's like this kind of wonderland place where there's some performers in there who are there for the whole afternoon, and the basic concept of it is to be able to let go with the performers. And it's kind of like a continuous group therapy. Like part of it actually is like a room where you talk with an alien about dreams that you have and like stories that people let out. And you're like, there's a lot of different layers. So like singing songs with someone or dancing with someone, or like being in this like temple-like room and being spun in by several performers, and just being in the space and knowing these people, and also knowing how for them it's also like letting go emotional baggage, going through a lot of emotions and inviting people to be part of this process, then experiencing like with the different flavors of the space, like subspaces there, how healing it is to have a play where and I mean a lot of subculture or culture for me revolves around play, but also having a room where play is about being okay with being weird and like taking the deeper emotions that you're very often not allowed to let out by social sanctioning. And this was so powerful to see, because I think a lot of, even if it's more progressive theater performance or participatory theater, it's often not at this deep level of having an interpersonal experience that is this because it's really you're in a space, you're in a world with someone, and it's this if you really can let go of this binary of performer and not performer as broken up, and you can actually see, okay, life is performance.
I love that, and it just reminds me how often in spaces I want to step into that play, and I'm always trying to clock like how open how rigid is the boundary, because it's like if somebody else creates a space and they have some idea of how they would like to orchestrate it. So I'm always like wondering, because it's like even if you just talk about throwing or contributing in a more like intellectual and talking space, I'm always like, I could tell you 15 things right now. I could take this topic and then run for it for the next hour. Of course, I've learned as someone who steps forward to step back. But yeah, I'm always like wondering, and I always try to create spaces where I'm like, okay, like now you step forward, you lead the pack, like what you have to bring. And it's always magic. That's the thing. Like, that's one of the reasons that you learn to step back. It's because you're like, yes, I would love to share all of my knowledge, but I already know it. And actually now you get to like receive all of the great gems that are hidden in the spirit of others that are just randomly in this space with you now. But I like that, and I'm extremely playful. Like, that's my nature. And I feel like I often struggle when things are heavy. And it might even be connected to my issues around intimacy, but I love it when the whole intentional context is play. And when it's in that intentional context, I'm very comfortable. And when it's put into something else, I'm a little like, am I going to be seen here? Because I think play is presence, play is presence. And like, how do you keep yourself present in spaces and in engagement? And like, I think one of the ways is to be able to laugh and smile and say hi again, and those are ways that I bring myself fully present into the process.
For me also, like being able to smile like means being able to smile with your soul.
I know,
like,
and I really struggle because, like for instance, I am connected very recently with a close friend, and she's a lovely human being, but you can see where somehow she's constantly trying to convince the choice is okay. And I'm just constantly having to go in this place of like, I really honestly need no convincing. I don't know who decided it was not okay. I don't live in that world. And so now I really see you convincing yourself because you keep telling the story. You know what I mean? And it's like, even though you are owning your right to say that you can be okay, and it is an issue because you live with stigma and that presses on you. But at the same time, I'm like, again, it's another one of these things. It's like, who decided that was weird? Who decided that was wrong? Who gets to decide who I choose to be and how I choose to express and live and grow and know myself and others? Like, I was privileged to be raised in an atmosphere where I decide. I'm the one who decides for me, and other people get to choose for themselves. And, I'm okay, you're okay. That's a book and something my mom used to say all the time. I'm okay, you're okay. And I am really, like, heartsick. I'm a little heartsick at the amount of they're just crawling out of the box, like the story of the box that engagement has become so woven in that, like, even as they tell their basic story, you can still see it as like trying to climb out of a box rather than it being play. I'm like, why wouldn't it be like, like I'm just like.
Yeah, and I think like one of the problems with play is how defined play is in what adults or so-called adults are allowed to play, and how much sanction there is constantly happening in public space and also interpersonal. Like, also how I can say for myself, like I often judge myself for playing and then realizing, okay, why am I doing this? That for me, something that I want to cultivate is opening up these places of play, whichever way of playing is for my existence in everyday life. A friend of mine says there's a lot of performances at parties and clubs, and people ask me like, is this an okay outfit for a club? And she's like, would you wear this outfit? Period. Why not wear it on the street? Like, yeah.
Oh, it reminds me of it was a circus gypsy birthday, and I wasn't even going to get into the problematic use of the term gypsy, considering especially I'm in a very like high population gypsy neighborhood, and this was not like ethically gypsy, the term of this context. And it was like you had to come in costume, and of course I love that. I was like, don't get me started. Half my wardrobe tucked away. It's like I'm. But then a lot of the men wore dresses, and like at some point I was like, but like, how is that a costume? That's just normal wear. Like, I just don't like. I'm just like, I'm really, Anyway, what were you saying about play? And something else I wanted to respond. Oh, I was gonna say, like, I have children, okay, and they're so hyper mature. Okay, they have a high level of emotional intelligence and social capacity, and they can be serious at times, but really in a light but mature way, right? And then you have, quote unquote Peter Pan syndrome and people who never want to grow up. So again, like I get this idea that somehow play is associated with childhood and that like maturity is somehow only congruent to adulthood is nonsense already. Like in my lived experience,
really funny experience I had also at a party where it was about like a dress code and people being very serious in a way. Like there were so many outfits where there was no fun, and people were dressing up, but like dressing in like caging themselves in a way, like not moving freely, and like this way of like queerness and like dressing up and drag and like the clothes wearing you or you wearing the clothes. And I don't know, like and at some point someone was like, I got a lot of compliments for my outfit, and at some point someone was like, wow, is that you? And I was so perplexed by this question, because who am I but not me? But thinking about it afterwards, it makes so much sense, because like the way that heteronormativity and also boxing in queerness works so often is like people being uncomfortable with themselves because like against the meaning of queer, like being like breaking up and disruption, but not for the sake of disruption, but because of for the sake of being us or me, or like some potential me. I mean, maybe sometimes this feeling of being dressed in is like being in a start of the process of like what actually is like resistance or like change, or like how do I change actually. But a thing a friend of mine said, like about who is organizing queer events, and was like, yeah, and we don't like necessarily call them queer, because people tend to have an image in their head when we say queer, and that's not what it's about. And this was really enlightening to me.
Not defined. Yeah, and this kind of goes back to the fascist and the anti-fascist discussion. I'm like, how further can we bleed these borders and these identities out even further? It's like clearing the space. It's like, let's make this a little less defined, let's allow for more expression. And I struggle with that as well, again, more in Europe, because I'm fundamentally raised in Islamic queer spaces. You have to imagine that they were by Sufi dervishes following Rumi. So there's always this quintessential, my sheikh coined the term scholartivist, so scholar, artist, activist. So then it was just like that idea of dynamic expression of identity that isn't like overly defined. And I struggled with this in California in alternative communities, because it was very faddish and you had to look very steampunk, like Burning Man. Like there's a look, the Burning Man haircut, there's a look, and it's just like there's a homogeneity that is starting to be developed within your alternative. And I struggle with that because I don't want to be hyper defined anywhere. Like I actually like being able to code switch and play in all the fields, because that feels the most free in terms of my nature. So yeah, that's definitely, I clocked you on that one. It's true.